Hey y'all. So if I'm gonna give you a lecture or whatever about some passages in Thoreau, I thought maybe first thing we could do is get the hell outside. And I'm not outside yet. I'm inside the second floor I built on my garage so I could store a bunch of shit and maybe grow some plants before the season. Today I could put these plants out, but it'll probably freeze again. But anyway, trying to grow some tiger eye beans here, little arugula, some herbs like dill and stuff. Got some pretty good roots on this guy. Figure I could put him into a larger container. All right. Give everybody else some water and get on with our class. So remember what I said about Thoreau's prose and how it's always being written in a number of levels. And I think you should take that metaphor, the way he puns on words and gives them alternative meanings as he writes. I think you should immediately look at those levels just the way you do Emerson's levels of our perception and use of nature, from commodity to beauty to discipline and so on. And each level is a little bit deeper than the next, perhaps, but it certainly should be differentiated from it. So what I want you to do is open right to the beginning of Walden, to the beginning pages of this chapter called Economy. I know I didn't assign it, but it gives you a great example of Thoreau speaking on a couple of different levels and being real sneaky about it, and it's not easy. But you have to know the puns when they go, as they fly by. He starts off completely literally, talks about going down to Walden Pond in Concord, living by the labor of his hands. Yeah, he sort of did it. Sort of. Does admit that he's back, that he's living, quote, civilized life again. You might argue that the word civilized is already a kind of pun. He doesn't mean civilized. He doesn't think it's civilized at all. He's basically compromised again and back living in as a surveyor. But he also, very honestly tells you how this thing came about. That is, somebody asked him. I told you guys that while he was lecturing on Carlyle, somebody said, "What are you doing down at the pond?" He said, "I should not obtrude my affairs so much on the notice of readers if very particular inquiries had not been made by my townspeople concerning my mode of life, which some would call impertinent." Already, this is it. Is it the inquiries that are impertinent, or his mode of life that's impertinent? He's a very, very good writer. He knows how to write an English sentence, but he allows that ambiguity there. Was it his mode of life that was impertinent, that is rude to his society, or were the questions impertinent? He says, well, the questions weren't impertinent at all. He could also be talking about his mode of life being not impertinent either. Considering the circumstances, these were very natural and pertinent for his time. That is, that we should ask how we are living our lives for any time is very pertinent. It's a very pertinent question. Some ask what I got to eat, if I did not feel lonesome, if I was afraid, and the like. Others have been curious to learn what portion of my income I devoted to charitable purposes. Some who have large families, how many poor children I maintained. And the word charitable and the word poor are already flashing on the page a couple of different ways. What is charity? He's going to ask later in this chapter called Economy. Is charity only giving to others out of sympathy, or is real charity giving of ourselves, our whole selves, all the time to everybody, right? And of course, the poor children. You wouldn't think that poor would be a joke here, but what does he mean by poor? Does he mean a child who doesn't have enough to eat, or a child who doesn't know how to live and is raised in a way that does not teach that child how to live fully? I will therefore ask those of my readers who feel no particular interest in me to pardon me if I undertake to answer some of these questions in this book, because the answers aren't for him, they're for other people. And in most books, the I, or first person, is omitted. In this, it will be retained. That in respect to egotism is the main difference. What does he really mean by in respect to egotism? When people omit the I, sometimes they're being more egotistical than they are when they admit their mistakes, when they admit or brag about their attempts to live a full life. Unfortunately, he writes a little later, I am confined to this theme by the narrowness of my experience. Confined to this theme by the narrowness of experience. We always consider the people who have the most experience to be on a kind of horizontal plane, much larger, more well-traveled, more experienced in terms of things outside of themselves. Of course, what Thoreau is recalling here is the idea of narrowness is an illusion. Narrowness, that is the fact that he has stayed along in Concord, and even by the side of Walden Pond for this 2 years, has actually given him a depth and a knowledge of himself that other people who are so much more well-traveled do not have. So it goes on. He does argue for those who consider him again an egotist, that he wants to put this mode of life on everyone else. Everyone ought to live in a cabin. I think that's the worst reading of this book, that Thoreau is literally telling us we all should go back to the land, and that's why I decided to start here in an alley in Wilmette, Illinois. Perhaps these pages are more particularly addressed to poor students, that is, people who haven't learned how to live. Forget the school. How about the school of life? As for the rest of my readers, they will accept such portions as apply to them. I trust that none will stretch the seams in putting on the coat, for it may do good service to him who it fits. So he understands he's not going to reach this whole audience that will pick up this book, but some people will get the levels on which he's writing. Okay, so one of the best metaphors to point out here in Thoreau's Where I Lived and What I Lived For, it works on so many different levels, is this idea of sleeping. And of course, he's trying to wake his neighbors up to these new ideas, but he touches on some literal things that are sleeping as well here, especially when he gets to this passage on railroads, page 1029, and Where I Lived and What I Lived For. He's just complaining that we live too fast. We think it's essential that the nation have commerce and export ice and talk through a telegraph, etc. If we do not get out sleepers and forge rails and devote days and nights to work, that's obvious, but to go tinkering upon our lives to improve them, well, who will build railroads? If railroads are not built, how shall we get to heaven in season? But if we stay home and mind our business, who will want railroads? So this relates not only to the metaphor of sleeping, but to the metaphor of travel, which extends to even going to the post office, which is a kind of traveling, looking for news elsewhere. If we do not ride on the railroad, he continues, it rides. We do not ride on the railroad, he continues, it rides upon us. Do you ever think that those sleepers are what those sleepers are that underlie the railroad? Here's a sleeper, folks. This is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to it. It's a railroad tie buried in this ballast here. Ever think of those sleepers? Each one is a man, an Irish man or a Yankee man. So he's commenting on the fact that here we are completely prejudiced against Irish people, but Yankees and Irish alike are being run over by our new system of commerce. And he basically represents our system of commerce by the railroad and by the sleepers under them. The rails are laid on them and they are covered with sand, and the cars run smoothly over them. They are sound sleepers, I assure you. And every few years a new lot is laid down and run over, so that if some have the pleasure of riding on a rail, others have the misfortune to be ridden upon. So he's glad to know, he finishes that paragraph, that it takes a gang of men for every 5 miles to keep the sleepers down and level in their beds as it is for this is a sign that they may sometime get up again. Of course, he's talking about frost and the way it heaves railroad ties, but he's metaphorically referring to a possibility that some people like himself and others convinced by this book might change their ways. So, on to our next venue. You know, it's funny, you're down here at the lake and you think of all the people who live on the beach and stuff, and you think, yeah, Thoreau is for them, not me. 1018 in Economy. Thoreau actually underlines the fact that this is a metaphor, folks. He says, one young man of my acquaintance who has inherited some acres told me he thought he should live as I did if he had the means. I would not have anyone adopt my mode of living on any account, for beside that, before he has learned it, I may have found out another for myself. I desire that they be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's or his mother's or his neighbor's instead. And I think a lot of us end up modeling our lives on some plan that precedes us. And Thoreau here is actually saying that the model he has demonstrated at this stupid cabin at Walden Pond is just a model. It's just a metaphor. It's really a means of expressing what he believes is the intentionality and fullness of life that we all ought to be living wherever we are. And granted, I guess I gotta go to the woods, right? We're talking about the road, I gotta go to the woods. Well, it's not much of a woods now, is it? No leaves on the trees, everything's still dead. But you kind of wonder, is this just nature looking as it does on the surface? Can we really see what should inspire us beneath it? If you look really carefully, you can see through here, beyond that tree, some leaves, but there it is. See if I can zoom in and get that to focus. Yeah, man. There's some real leaves waiting for us. Okay, folks, here's another little tour. The backyard of my house that I've built over the last 25 years. Still working on the trim here, up here in this railing. But this is where I do my planting in a very literal sense. This is something you guys could do too. I mean, it's incredible how much you can grow in these 2 foot by 3 foot deals. I attach, the tomato plants grow so high, I tie them off way up there, and yeah, I've got spinach growing in there right now. It's just starting out. Try it sometime. It's awesome growing your own food. Anyway, so I said earlier on that the Transcendentalists didn't have much to say about religious things, especially death and judgment. But ultimately, and really early on in this, where I lived and what I lived for, Thoreau actually does go there. And it's actually in his bit about farming and about this half-joking discussion of almost buying the Hollowell farm. He says, the bottom of 1024, all that I could say then with respect to farming on a large scale, I've always cultivated a garden, not 2 by 3, but he had a little garden, was that I had my seeds ready. Many think that seeds improve with age, and he's seeds becomes this, literal thing that is, some people literally thought seeds improve with age, and that there's seeds they found in Egypt that could be planted and grow wheat from that era. Having your seeds ready also as a term for soaking your seeds or putting them in a cold cellar right before you plant them, so that the seeds think that it's time to sprout and stuff like that. But so that's having your seeds ready. But having your seeds ready also means to see yourself as a seed. That one day, shall plant. Many think that seeds improve with age, and sort of the seed becomes the person aging. I have no doubt that time discriminates between the good and the bad. And when at last I shall plant, I shall be less likely to be disappointed. So as a farmer, if he's got your seeds ready, when you finally plant, you ought to get a good crop. But of course, he's talking about when he dies. If he follows this philosophy, if he pays attention to the things you ought to pay attention to and not to the trivial and to the pursuits of others and defined by others, that you will be less likely to be disappointed. I'm not sure if he's thinking about being part of the elect or anything, but he's certainly thinking about having done some good in the world and having inspired others to have done better. But I would say to my fellows once and for all, as long as possible, live free and uncommitted. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or to the county jail. Committed, two senses of committed, obviously, there too. Anywhere you look in this text, you'll find more there. Yep, anywhere you look in this text, you will find more than you thought before. I've been reading it and working on it for, 30 years. So I hope you enjoyed the weird presentation of Thoreau out of doors. And please don't miss the paper I shared with you, the draft of my chapter from my memoir called Working with My Hands. As you can see, this is pretty central to my being, thinking about it, for quite a long time. And I don't know, I hope you get the bug.